Forgotten genius. Picture the world of the 1920s. A time of jazz, of radical art, of immense social and scientific upheaval. In the hollowed, wood-paneled halls of Europe's most prestigious universities, giants like Einstein, Bohr, and Heisenberg were tearing down the old certainties of Newtonian physics and building a strange new quantum reality in its place. It was a world dominated by men, by tweed jackets, pipe smoke, and booming voices echoing in lecture theaters. But in a quiet, dusty corner of one of these institutions, a mind was at work that saw even further than the giants. A mind that belonged to a young woman named Dr. Elara Vance. She wasn't just participating in the quantum revolution, she was about to launch a new one entirely, and the establishment had no idea what was about to hit them. Elara was a prodigy, a quiet force of nature who saw the universe not as a collection of particles, but as a symphony of interconnected frequencies. While her peers were grappling with the wave-particle duality, Elara was already asking the next question. If everything can be a wave, what is the medium? What is the fundamental orchestra playing the music of reality? Her doctoral thesis, a dense 500-page manuscript titled On the Nature of Harmonic Resonance and Space-Time Substructure, was her answer. It was a work of such breathtaking audacity and mathematical elegance that her own advisor, the elderly and kind-hearted Professor Alistair Finch, confessed he had to read it 3 times before he could even begin to grasp its implications. Her theory proposed something utterly radical. She argued that what we perceive as empty space is anything but. Instead, she posited a vibrant, invisible matrix, a subquantum lattice that connects every single point in the universe. According to Vance, particles weren't just moving space, they were localized high-frequency vibration space itself. Her equations, scribbled furiously across chalkboards and notebooks, showed how 2 seemingly separate particles, even those light years apart, could remain linked through a shared resonant frequency on this lattice. She called it sympathetic entanglement, a concept that predated the formal EPR paradox by over a decade and described quantum entanglement with a clarity that was simply unheard of. But she didn't stop there. The most dangerous part of her thesis was the final chapter. In it, she theorized that by manipulating these harmonic frequencies, one could potentially bypass the constraints of conventional spacetime. It wasn't a blueprint for a warp drive, not yet, but it was the fundamental physics that suggested such a thing was not just science fiction, but an eventual engineering problem. When she defended her thesis, the room was electric with a mixture of awe and profound discomfort. The doctoral committee, a panel of 5 distinguished gray-haired physicists, were visibly stunned. A few of the younger academics in the audience were scribbling notes, their minds racing. For a fleeting moment, it seemed like Elara Vance was on the cusp of glory. Professor Finch, beaming with pride, declared it the most significant work he had ever supervised. Whispers of a new star in the physics firmament began to circulate. A newspaper clipping from a local academic journal might have briefly mentioned her name, a footnote in the grand story of 1920 science. It was a fragile, beautiful moment of recognition, a brief dawn before a long and deliberate night. But the tension was already palpable. The awe was quickly being replaced by something else, apprehension. Her work didn't just add a new chapter to the book of physics, it demanded the entire book be rewritten. It challenged deeply entrenched theories that men had built their entire careers, their entire reputations upon. It was one thing for an Einstein to propose relativity. He was already part of the club. It was another thing entirely for a young, unknown woman to suggest that everyone in the room had been looking at the universe in the wrong way. The questions from the committee became less curious and more pointed, more aggressive. They weren't trying to understand. They were trying to find a flaw, a crack in her logic they could use to dismiss the whole thing. They searched for a loose thread they could pull to unravel the beautiful, terrifying tapestry she had woven. They found none. Her mathematics was impeccable. Her logic was sound. And that, for them, was the most terrifying part of all. The initial, fleeting recognition was over. The silent, systematic campaign to bury the most brilliant PhD of the 20th century was about to begin. Academic suppression, sexism. The backlash was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, suffocating poison. It began in the hushed conversations in faculty lounges, in the smoke-filled back rooms of private clubs where academic politics were decided. The architect of this campaign was Professor Albrecht Schmidt, a man whose own work on quantum mechanics was considered foundational. He was a gatekeeper of the old guard, a man whose influence could make or break careers. And in Elara Vance, he saw not a brilliant colleague, but an existential threat. Her theory, if true, would render a significant portion of his life's work obsolete, a mere stepping stone to a much grander truth he had failed to see. His ego, intertwined with the patriarchal structure of the academy, could not abide it. The first tactic was to frame her work as feminine and therefore unscientific. Anonymous peer reviews commissioned by Schmidt's allies began to circulate. They didn't engage with her mathematics. They couldn't. Instead, they attacked the very nature of her ideas. Her theory of harmonic resonance was derided as Pythagorean mysticism, a flight of fancy more suited to a poet than a physicist. Her concept of a connected universe was dismissed as untestable philosophy, a thinly veiled insult suggesting she was incapable of rigorous empirical thought. They used her gender as a weapon, implying her insights were the product of female intuition rather than intellectual labor. It was a classic insidious strategy. If you can't attack the argument, attack the person. Reframe their brilliance as a character flaw. Next came the denial of platforms. Elara submitted her thesis for publication to the leading physics journals of the day. The rejections came back with bewildering speed. They were polite but firm, citing a lack of relevance to current experimental trends or speculative claims that fall outside the scope of this journal. It was a coordinated blockade. Schmidt and his network of allies sat on the editorial boards of these journals. A single letter from Schmidt to a journal editor was all it took, a quiet word over brandy and cigars to ensure her paper would never see the light of day. She was also systematically excluded from the intellectual conversations of her time. Invitations to major conferences, like the famous Solvay conferences where the future of physics was being debated, never arrived. When her advisor, Professor Finch, tried to present her work on her behalf, he was met with polite dismissal and a suggestion that he was letting his fondness for a promising, if misguided, student cloud his judgment. Finch, old and nearing retirement, found his own reputation under threat and was pressured into silence. The isolation was devastating. Elara found herself in a professional wilderness. Colleagues who had once eagerly discussed ideas with her now avoided eye contact in the hallways. The funding for her postdoctoral research mysteriously dried up. She was being professionally ghosted, erased from the community before she even had a chance to properly join it. The final, most brutal act was the literal burial of her work. In the university archives, a place of supposed scholarly sanctity, her thesis was mislabeled. It wasn't filed under theoretical physics or quantum mechanics. It was deliberately cataloged under History of Obsolete Alchemical Theories. It was an act of profound academic vandalism, a quiet, bureaucratic assassination designed to ensure no future researcher would ever stumble upon it. A librarian's hand is seen changing the catalog card, hiding it in plain sight, consigning it to a dusty oblivion. This wasn't an accident. It was a calculated move to sever her from history, to turn her revolutionary science into a forgotten footnote, a quirky dead end. It was the ultimate expression of a system that feared disruption, especially when that disruption came in the form of a woman who dared to be more brilliant than the men in charge. Block 3. Rediscovery. Hidden Legacy. For nearly a century, the system won. Elara Vance, stripped of her career and her voice, faded into obscurity. She never published again. The vibrant symphony of the universe she had uncovered was silenced, and physics moved on, taking a longer, more arduous path. Concepts that mirrored her ideas would eventually surface, piecemeal, over decades. Quantum entanglement was confirmed. The search for a theory of everything began, and the idea of a subatomic, foam-like structure to space-time became a serious topic of debate in string theory. But these were echoes of a song that had already been written, disparate clues to a puzzle that Elara Vance had solved in its entirety back in 1928. Humanity was essentially rediscovering continents that she had already mapped. Imagine the progress we lost. Would we have had a unified field theory by the 1960s? Could the information paradox of black holes have been solved before it was even a paradox? These are the ghosts of a future that was stolen from us. The rediscovery, when it finally came, was almost by accident. In 2024, a brilliant and tenacious astrophysics graduate student named Dr. Lena Petrova was digging through the digital archives of that same European university. She was researching the history of women in science, specifically looking for figures who had been marginalized. She came across a single, tantalizing footnote in the personal letters of Professor Alastair Finch, Elara's old advisor. In a letter to a friend, written years after his retirement, he lamented his greatest failure, mentioning a revolutionary thesis by a student named Vance, a work of genius the world was not ready for. The letter mentioned the thesis had been lost to the archives. Petrova was hooked. This mention of a lost thesis became her obsession. She spent months combing through records, hitting dead end after dead end. The official archives had no record of an Elara Vance in the physics department. It was as if she never existed. But Petrova was a modern researcher with modern tools. She used cross-referencing software and keyword searches that were impossible in the past. She finally found a match, not in physics, but in a bizarre, miscategorized digital folder labeled Esoteric and Alchemical Studies. There it was, a scanned PDF of a 500-page manuscript on the nature of harmonic resonance and space-time substructure by Elara Vance. At first, Petrova thought it was a crank paper. But as she read, her skepticism turned to disbelief, and disbelief turned to pure, unadulterated awe. The mathematics was dense but flawless. The concepts were staggering. Petrova ran Vance's core equations through a modern quantum computer simulation, and the results that came back were paradigm-shattering. Vance's theory didn't just align with modern quantum field theory and string theory, it unified them. It elegantly solved problems that physicists were still struggling with. It was the missing piece of the puzzle, a Rosetta Stone for the universe. And it had been sitting in a digital dungeon for decades, hidden by a label born of pure malice and fear. The publication of Petrova's paper, Rediscovering Vance, a lost unified theory of the 20th century, sent shockwaves through the scientific community. It was a bombshell. It wasn't just the reclamation of a forgotten genius, it was a profound indictment of the historical narrative of science. It proved that the path of progress isn't a clean linear march forward. It's a messy, human story, shaped by prejudice, ego, and power. The story of Dr. Elara Vance forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. How many other Vances are out there? How many brilliant discoveries have been buried? How many voices silenced, not because their ideas were wrong, but because the person who had them didn't fit the established mold? Her legacy is a powerful reminder that we must constantly challenge the histories we are given and actively seek out the stories that have been deliberately left untold. Because somewhere in a dusty archive or a forgotten footnote might lie the key to our future.